Democracies, they're more peaceful because their citizens have more skin in the game. And they have more skin in the game because of these taxes and because of things like conscription being called up. When you have a war tax, especially in the two world wars, people will directly associate what's coming out of their pocket with the war that's being fought. Leaders will be they'll be so tempted to just engage in borrowing if they can, because it's something that the public won't see. And so they can kind of go off and fight these wars without being held accountable. The US was able to just kind of issue more debt instead of having to pay as you go with war taxes. Instead of being in perpetual peace, we're in perpetual war. Afghanistan was a 2-decade-long war. And I think there's a pretty clear theoretical logic that would tell us why, which is, in a lot of ways, no reason not to continue, because no one was having to debate that continuation in any meaningful way.
Welcome to the Microscopic Podcast presented by GoldRepublic. My name is Alexei Joranov, and in this format I invite you to look at the world through different lenses, to see what's hidden in plain sight. We'll dive deep to understand the forces that drive macroeconomics, financial markets, and the emergence of a new monetary system with some money like gold, silver, and digital assets like Bitcoin. We'll also investigate how geopolitics and power games shape the world we live in, but also what can we learn from history to understand the present and prepare for the future. I hope you will get fresh insight and enjoy this conversation. If you do, as always, please give it a like and subscribe, but also leave your actions down below in the comment section and share it to those who need to hear this. But before I start, I'd like you to know that if you open an account at GoldRepublic, you will receive 1 free gram of gold. Just click on the link in the description. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Kreps to the Microscopic Podcast. Dr. Sarah Kreps is an American political scientist, United States Air Force veteran, and policy analyst who focuses on U.S. foreign and defense policy. She's a professor of government at Cornell University, adjunct professor of law at Cornell Law School, and an adjunct scholar at West Point Modern War Institute. She's also the author of 4 books, including 2 on drones, another on U.S. military interventions after the Cold War, and the most recent, and How the United States Pays for Its War, the book that I have right here, Taxing Wars. She's also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and her writings have appeared on the Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, CNBC, and CNN, among other outlets. Sarah, it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Alexei. Good to be here.
So we've met at Bitcoin Atlantis, where Alex Gladstein invited you on a conversation about taxing wars. That's the book that I've just mentioned, that I've went through, and I have to say it's pretty deep and has a lot of material about the topic. So we'll obviously address this, but you have also been busy with covering AI and what it entails also in modern warfare. So we'll cover all kinds of topics today. But my first question is, first of all, do you have anything to add or amend about the introduction I've made about you?
No, I think it was great. I guess I would just say to thread those different issues that you talked about. My research, my teaching, my commentary is on emerging technologies and the political and policy impacts of those. And so, yes, I've covered drones, AI, and crypto. And I come at this from a perspective of someone who is, as you said, working in a law school, a public policy school, and a department of government. And so I look at from those perspectives at how new technologies emerge and what happens when they emerge, who responds. And so that's what all of those different issues have in common. So one of the questions I often get is, how you study all these things, how are they related? They don't seem related at all. So I thought I would just kind of thread some of those together for the interest of listeners, but also I think to sort of foreground some of maybe what we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I actually would be curious about also your personal journey is, how did you end up in the United States Air Force?
So that's a long story, but the quick story was that my grandfather was in the Army, and he told me some of the stories from North Africa and from Europe, and I thought it was kind of a good thing to do for the country, good thing to do for discipline. But this was it was at a time before the U.S. was involved in all of the recent wars. So it seemed like a good way to also pay for college. But then the big wars, recent wars started. So then there was kind of this moment of thinking about what these consequences are. How do we, again, kind of leading up to probably what we're going to talk about, how do we actually even pay for these wars? Mm-hmm. So when I was in the Air Force, but I wasn't a pilot. And, but there's a lot of the military that is, including the Air Force, it's not actually flying planes, but I was involved in the engineering side and the budget side. And so I got to see both how we develop new technologies, new radar systems, but also how we pay for them. And that, I think, that experience very much informed why I wanted to study the academic topics that I cover today. So technologies and money.
And that, I think, is also an interesting overcross, especially in political science. I think you don't always study the money side. It's a bit of a tunnel vision, I guess, also depending on the field you are in. But I think nowadays it's more and more common to see like this overcross and this basically, this kind of merging of disciplines, because everything becomes more holistically important and the way we do things. So mm-hmm. Technology obviously has a big importance in all kinds of domains nowadays. But so what is, let's say, what was the main driver in wanting to investigate the money side on your side? Because I guess you've been dealing with billion budgets, big sums that for you might not seem immense, but compared to the grand scheme of things. But on stage, you were saying like, yeah, I've been, I was responsible for spending $1 billion back then, which inflation adjusted is obviously mm-hmm. much more in today's terms. Mm-hmm. Can you maybe share a bit more about this experience?
Yeah. I think it was really eye-opening for me as a 23-year-old to have this really big budget. And I, as I mentioned on stage in Madeira, I had friends working at Goldman Sachs, one of the big banks in New York that had far less financial or monetary responsibility. And I didn't know anything about anything. And here I was given this big budget. And this just got me thinking about kind of accountability questions. So I happened to be stationed in Massachusetts in the United States. And we were one of the last military bases in the northeastern United States for a lot of reasons that are beyond the scope, I think, of this podcast. But bases in the Northeast just started closing, and I think part of it is population density compared to other parts of the country. But the one base that was kept open was where I worked. And the reason it was kept open year after year was this one senator, Ted Kennedy, who every year every time there were these what were called base closure, it was called the BRAC. And so periodically, every 5 years or so, there would be these discussions about, well, which bases should we close? And every time he used his political capital to keep open this one last base in the Northeast, and in particular in his state. And so those kinds of experiences are very eye-opening as well, because you just start thinking about kind of the politics of decisions that seem on their face like they should be strategy-driven or economically driven. And so in the end, what I started thinking about is all of these decisions, to your point, you can't just study them from a perspective of economics or from a perspective of politics or from strategy. You need to get the answer to these puzzles. You need to bring these different disciplines together. But in universities at academic research, there are so many incentives against doing interdisciplinary research. So people who study politics, there aren't that many who also study economics, and it's hard to do them well. One of the good things about research, especially I think more recently in the last couple of decades, is collaboration. So academic collaborations where you can kind of bring different people together and their expertise. But yes, that's how I came about some of these questions, is these personal experiences and observations and puzzles that I had that I wanted answers to.
So in this book, which is very thorough, I mean, it's also like lots of sources. I guess you spend a lot of also time and effort to really synthesize that into that book. And it's also just answering one fundamental question, which is basically accountability in a democracy when leading a war as a country. And it does go also back in time. So maybe that would be also nice to have a bit of a chronology of how it started and how it evolved. And now in the case of the US, how the US as a state, and actually maybe there's also maybe a good, initial point we could start from with it, which is the Civil War, which the Confederates actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, lost this war based on the lack of financial means. And because they were basically borrowing more than they could. But we might talk that about a later point, but maybe trace back on how the US has shifted from levying direct taxes to fund wars instead of relying more on the deficit spending and the borrowing. What were the, let's say, key historical turning points that facilitated this transition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I realized I may have sidestepped part of your previous question. So maybe I'll try to answer part of that previous question and this one now together. So, in addition to kind of being provoked by some of my personal experiences, from an academic perspective, where this idea emerged was that I was talking to people who study other countries and study conflicts in other countries like Latin America. And this person was studying Colombia and Costa Rica and the security taxes that were levied there to pay for the conflicts. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because the U.S. doesn't do that. And around that same time, I was reading a book that was very prominent at that time, which was called Democracies at War. And the idea behind it was that democracies would fight, let's say, smarter wars. They would select into better wars and fight better in the context of those wars because of the accountability mechanisms that we have in a democracy. And those accountability mechanisms drew from people like Immanuel Kant, who I just realized yesterday, apparently his 400th birthday is coming up. And so there are these commemorations. Well, he had written this book called The Perpetual Peace. And the argument was that democracies essentially they're more peaceful because their citizens have more skin in the game. And they have more skin in the game because of these taxes and because of things like conscription being called up. So I had written on drones before, and I realized that, countries like the United States and European democracies, we don't have conscription anymore. So there's no real skin in the game in that regard. And then I started thinking about, again, this kind of nexus of, well, are we doing what Kant says we would do about taxes, issuing or levying taxes to have the public pay for the wars that are meant to provide security for the public. And the US wasn't doing that either. So I started looking back at the history and realizing that it wasn't always the case that the US was just going into debt. And this was a quite recent phenomenon. And the Civil War is a really good case. And it is true that there are a lot of reasons that the outcome was what it was, but the financial picture was a big part of that, which is that the South was printing money. They didn't have, and that created these inflationary cycles to its detriment. And so look at, and I guess kind of tying in one more thing. I talked about Kant and the perpetual peace. But there are I started kind of digging around. So Adam Smith in the Wealth of Nations, he predicted this. He said that leaders will be, they'll be so tempted to just engage in borrowing if they can, because it's something that the public won't see. And so they can kind of go off and fight these wars without being held accountable. So that preceded the perpetual peace. And I think kind of speaks to that, that contention around kind of how countries pay for wars. But it's completely the case that in the last couple of decades, the U.S. has not issued any war taxes to pay for its wars. And one of the things that Alex mentioned that, and he and I spoke about this after the conversation, the fireside chat that he and I had, is he talked about going off the gold standard in the early 70s and how, to your point about interdisciplinary research, I think is a really important point. I hadn't thought about that. And I think that probably did play a role in terms of why the U.S. then was able to just kind of issue more debt instead of having to pay as you go with war taxes.
Yes, and it ties back to, I think you also, like in the beginning of the book, in the first chapters, you kind of laid down as well the direct, like if you look back at all the major conflicts, so there was the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, then the Gulf War, Afghan, Iraq. I mean, then the list goes on, and there's also small-scaled, like, smaller interventions, I would say. And you also, there's a graph that shows about also the propensity, the cost of war. There's not just a human cost of war, which is the first argument, which maybe could be the initial argument, is that your son, your daughter, whoever, like your children, will go be conscribed and fight and probably die on, like, basically whatever cause that might be. And you need to justify that cause either through ideology or political interest or all kinds of other stories that the politicians might arise. But as we progressed throughout decades and centuries, war became less costing in a human life perspective and more on a financial perspective. So by spending more, you might also avoid basically human lives. And I guess also as your experience of, if I'm not mistaken, you've been operating drones.
Not directly. I was part of the back end of it, which is the engineering and the financing.
Okay, yeah. So, indirectly then is also one of the arguments of using drones is to not have the risk of having a human basically losing his or her life in that process. And that those wars accounted for, and for example, now you can see the peak in this graph that I might show on the screen, World War II, where it reached almost 50% of GDP at its peak. And that all those wars were first levied through taxes, but then were basically deviated into more borrowing scheme and issuing debt, which per se is also an incentive to bypass the popularity factor that the politician will have to face. Do you have maybe examples that kind of show like that particular aspect of the difference, the key difference between those two types of financing war in history?
An example that would illustrate this point, I think, is the Vietnam War and the way in which President Johnson did not want to subject the war to public debate. And he continued to tell his advisors that the economic advisors kept pushing for tax increases. And one of the reasons they were pushing for tax increases, this was in the 60s, is that often in history, wars lead to inflation. Like I was saying with the Civil War, and they lead to inflation because there tends to be like demand shock, which is kind of a surge in demand for certain things, but also a difficulty in continuing to supply goods in the same way. And so you have a surge in demand chasing fewer goods, which leads to increases in inflation. And so Johnson's economic advisors were saying, look, we really need to raise taxes, because what taxes do, a little bit like what we've seen in the last couple of years with interest rate increases. So you want to make things, you basically want to take money out of the financial system, and you do that by taxing people so that they don't have as much disposable income to be spending. But he didn't want to do that because a tax increase was going to require Congress and public consent. And so what he did this thing called gradual escalation. So instead of having a big kind of push into Vietnam that would have a big debate and then you'd need money to do it, it was a little by little gradual escalation to do this in a way that would not subject the entire effort to public and legislative debate. So it's that what I call in the book the hide and seek wars, which is you just kind of avoid the whole debate by borrowing, which, even in the last couple of years and periodically, the US has these debates about the debt ceiling. Mm. But the interesting thing about those debates is that they're not about a particular source of debt. So you have this debate about, well, should we raise the debt ceiling? But no one's ever saying, well, look, the amount we're spending on war is this, and the amount we're spending on social programs is that. Which should we cut? What should we do? It's just kind of this generic debt. Whereas when you have a war tax, and we saw this in the two, especially in the two world wars, is these are called actual war taxes. And so people will directly associate what's coming out of their pocket with the war that's being fought. And one of the things that really surprised me, I think I mentioned this in Atlantis, is that I went to the Roosevelt Library in upstate New York, and they have all these letters from people that Roosevelt received during the war. And it was just amazing, the public reaction to these war taxes. People like librarians from Ohio saying, we just don't have the resources to keep paying these war taxes, or labor groups or church groups. And so it's what that really illustrated to me was this mechanism of that connection between public consent, well, sort of like how the war is paid for, public consent, and the ability for the government to continue carrying out the war. And so looking at these recent wars, it's correlational, of course. I can't say that the reason why these recent wars were longer and costly is because we didn't have war taxes, but there is a theoretical reason why that would be the case. And what we do know is that is the fact that Afghanistan was a 2-decade-long war. And, I think there's a pretty clear theoretical logic that would tell us why, which is that there was, in a lot of ways, no reason not to continue, because no one was having to debate that continuation in any meaningful way, especially once there was a much greater reliance on drones and because against this whole backdrop the whole time, no one's actually paying the cost.
I think that's it was a bit of an eye-opener, but it's a bit straightforward, is that if you pay a tax, as you mentioned, you pay it straight away. There's no deferred, let's say, payment. Mm-hmm. And that was like a one-on-one thing. It was kind of a direct causation, to say. But now with borrowing, you basically defer that moment you need to pay back to the next generation. So it's a bit of anachronic deferred payment thing that obviously we just now talk about now in the case of military spending, but it is just in general the problem that we have with this big massive debt that is accumulated through especially the last 50 years, and that coincides as well with the decoupling of the dollar from gold. And that was, I think, maybe one of the things that, as you mentioned, Johnson was also having on parallel a lot of welfare programs or domestic programs that would basically, with the Great Society Act, or I forgot the exact name, that basically made that untenable and not anymore like viable for the system to finance, and thereby it's also a new paradigm then. And as you say, like there's a difference between the moment where the state can only afford to fight so long and so much, and where you have unlimited money available, and you basically also through, I guess, military industrial complex are incentivized to sell. I mean, that this Lockheed Martin and all kinds of other military industrial complex actors have an incentive to send weapons abroad and use them, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a visceral kind of cycle where actually war is incentivized, and that's kind of where we're at right now, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, the question, I guess, to that would be then what gets us out of that cycle? Because at least in the US context, I think it's pretty clear that there is no appetite for any kind of conflict at this point. So, I don't know, why, because kind of what you're talking about, what I'm talking about almost suggests that we should, instead of being in perpetual peace, we should be in perpetual war. But I guess it goes back to what we were saying, is that in political science, in kind of these calculations, there is so multi-causal. It's hard to point to one or three or whatever number of things and say, this is how the world works. And so, and one of the things, I think about kind of what is the geopolitical landscape in the U.S. Like, what would be that war that we would expect? Like, this question of like, why do countries that have, like the U.S., that have basically unlimited, act as though they have unlimited resources? Why do they finally actually enter these almost like isolationist cycles? Because that's sort of what I would say the U.S. is closer to right now than a perpetual war kind of cycle. So I guess there is a point at which even those countries get to a point of almost exhaustion or attrition, where it's just like there is no political appetite for that anymore. So maybe it's to say that it is a complicated picture, and one that we can't say deterministically, like, even if you have these factors present, we're going to expect to see perpetual war, because we won't, and we don't. That the world is a lot more complicated than that. But I think what we could say is that if there were kind of a proximate cause, right? So I think all those factors are important in the recipe, but you need kind of you need like a match to kind of light the fire, and you aren't going to just get matches anywhere. And I think I would just say that it seems like, looking at the US, we haven't had quite that like proximate cause, even if we have kind of a tinderbox of factors that if we had the right proximate cause, we would expect this to blow up again. But I think it's more of a kind of like a watch, like to sort of say probabilistically, here's what happened, here are the things to be concerned about, rather than to say deterministically, yeah, this is how it's going to be. Because, politics is not even as we like to, we call it political science, but more emphasis on the politics than the science.
Yeah, the science part of the political part is obviously very tricky. It's not like you're in a lab and you can test different things and you can write them down. You have to look back at history. So one of the things that also like always flabbergasts me is about the fact that, for example, the Pentagon is been failing every single audit since it's been mandated in the 90s, I think. They kind of like shows a bit this revealing side of also the budget part, and I would be curious like to hear about your experience you've been, I think if I'm not mistaken, working there for a few years or some time. How do you explain that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's explained by just the largesse that at some point an organization has so many resources that it no longer has any even capacity for accountability. And, we saw that in Afghanistan, just like these audits of billions of dollars just kind of vanishing. And that's, I think, a concern with when you keep adding zeros to anything, that it's almost like funny money, that no one is really paying attention anymore. And, it's not, I think it's more likely with government organizations. But I think we even saw this with the tech community in the last couple of years leading up to about last year, which is that they just kind of grew. Facebook, Meta, whatever, Twitter just kept growing because that's just what organizations want to do, is they want to grow. And then they just weren't financially solvent. And what happens in the private sector is that the markets kind of dictate that. Look, you're not financially solvent. No one wants to invest in Meta because you have this organization that has too much bloat. But in the public, and so what they did is, and I think Elon Musk kind of led this at Twitter, cutting 75% of the workforce. And there were some people who said, well, that's a real problem because they're not doing whatever that they used to. But it turned out that actually, the platform was functioning mostly as it did before. And then what you saw is all these other platforms, all these other tech organizations starting to cut 10, 20% of their workforce as well, and managing to function and actually be leaner, and the stocks went up. So in the private sector, you have markets that can drive leanness and accountability. In the public sector, there's nothing quite analogous. And so there is that tendency just to become unaccountable.
Mm. And you also, in the book, identified the impossible trinity of leaders that face an increasing defense spending, maintaining social programs, while also being unable to readily raise taxes. Right? There's like this always, amount of factors that need to be balanced. How can this paradox be resolved? Do you think in the fiscal accountability?
No, I think it's a real issue, and it's gotten worse since I wrote the book, because when I wrote the book in the late 2010s, interest rates were low. We were in a period of quantitative easing, and even though the debt burden was high, we weren't having to pay huge, the amounts that we're paying now just to service the debt. But I think the U.S. is in this unusual and privileged position because it's the world's reserve currency. And it has that luxury of being able to not have to make choices. The political science and the economics literature for years talked about a guns butter trade-off. That countries will either spend on military or they'll spend on social programs as the butter. And what scholars realized a couple decades ago is that the U.S. doesn't actually make that trade-off anymore. It just spends on both. And the reason why that has happened in the U.S. case is that there are these very distinct everything in politics is coalitions. How do you get a coalition of people, elected leaders, to support a particular initiative? And on something like, for example, this thing called the Chips and Science Act, and it was this $50 billion piece of legislation in the United States to support domestic manufacturing of semiconductor chips that had all been pushed offshore during globalization. And so the reason that something like that gets through is because the left likes it because it's about supporting labor. The right likes it because there's an aspect of putting the screws to China. So you get the China hawks on the right. And that's what happens in this context we're talking about, is that the left supports generally, supports butter. The right supports guns. And the only way to get these very expensive pieces of appropriations legislation through is to just let everyone have their own way. And it means that the debt burden just keeps getting higher. And so people wonder, when will it get to the point where it's not sustainable? And it's hard to say what that point is, but clearly we're spending a lot on servicing the debt. And that's, again, particularly acute in this era of high interest rates.
Mm. And that's an interesting factor when we also look at geopolitics. You've mentioned China, and this is just one aspect, the economical aspect. Maybe on the chip side, there's much more maybe on that side as well. But we've also, for example, a few years ago, the US now finally pulling out of Afghanistan. That's Trump mandated and that Joe Biden executed. There was a lot of also chatter about how it's been done and criticism and so on and so forth. But do you think that's also kind of in the line of maybe the cost side, the financial side, or is it just purely geopolitical? Do you see in general a trend where the United States is going to be more picky about the way it operates its military power across the globe, because it also has immense cost on a daily basis? I think a few years back, I heard a number which said that just for fuel alone, the US military spends about $600 or $800 million a day.
A day.
I need to check my numbers. It's just on top of my head of what I remembered, but it was something staggering in those waters, and just in fuel, just to keep the people moving, basically. So it's also one of the things that Trump was being very vocal about, is that he wants to downsize the military presence around the globe to be able to bring back some of those dollars and spend them at home instead of abroad. But those dollars abroad are also power investments, so to say. It's basically maintaining trade routes, being able to assure like security assurances with partners and so on and so forth. So how do you see that balance in the coming years or in the coming decades?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. One of the things that interacts with this question you just asked is this question of reshoring. We had globalization and neoliberalism for decades. And there were some questions about whether that was sustainable. And we had protests, against globalization. But I think there was a view among the kind of decision-making class that mostly worked well. And generally kind of economists agreed that globalization and comparative advantage would have distributional consequences, but generally was net welfare enhancing. So, and I think we saw this a lot, which is that countries around the world, whether it was in Africa or Asia, so many, like hundreds of millions came out of poverty because of globalization. And it was really unusual to see that questioned. But what started happening in the mid-2010s is that there started to emerge this a part of the political mainstream that started to question neoliberalism and globalization. And we first saw this in around 2015 as the 2016 election was heating up in the United States. And Bernie Sanders, one of the Democratic candidates, was saying that the Trans-Pacific Trade Treaty was terrible because it was a disservice to American labor. And so Hillary Clinton, who as a Secretary of State had helped negotiate that, was put on the spot. Do you support this? And she said, well, I wouldn't support it were I to do it over. And so then Trump comes along on the Republican side, and the Republicans, historically, at least in the last several decades, have been free traders. He's not a free trader. And so then you get this new coalition, that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are not very different on this issue of trade. They're all about kind of U.S. domestic manufacturing, America first. And so now you have all these complicated reasons why we're seeing this retrenchment on both economic issues and military issues. And it's hard to, again, point to this one factor as to kind of why do we see that, but they very much are coinciding, kind of that geopolitical posture with the economic posture. And so these forces that seemed inexorable 5 years ago suddenly seem so powerful. Everything is focused now on the domestic interest rather than this international interest. And again, so many reasons why, these powerful forces of globalization, kind of these long and costly wars, but I'm sure COVID didn't help either. Kind of this sense that it's what is happening at home is a lot more important than what's happening elsewhere. But now it's hard to see kind of this shift away from globalization is, I think, very much coinciding with this return to, I don't know if I would call it isolationism, seems like a dirty word, but a shift to kind of rethinking a really aggressive international posture. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that it doesn't seem to, it seems to coincide, or it seems to be associated with fewer international military engagements, but the defense budgets remain high. So there is, in my mind, kind of a bit of a disconnect, which is, why do we stick with these really high defense budgets if we're not actually fighting these big wars? And the sense that as long as you're fighting these, or as long as you're spending all this money on defense, will you have this hammer where everything looks like a nail? What people would say, and I think you made this point directly or indirectly, is that there is a cost to be paid for patrolling, kind of ensuring that trade routes are safe and ensuring that people around the world are safe. And I think that the tricky thing about that from a political standpoint is, in kind of this era we seem to be in the United States of America first, it doesn't sell very well to say, look, we need to spend American tax dollars to patrol the seas. Even if, I think the problem is that for Americans, and I don't know how true this is in Europe, but there, I think, is this sense that the kind of a degree of separation. Well, it's almost like taken for granted that, well, why is what's happening over there, kind of these trade routes, how is that directly affecting me at home? And so the politics of this, I think, very much have shifted in the last few years.
You have also mentioned the chips and the fact that, for example, China has been targeted by the Biden administration by all kinds of bans of being able to export any kind of technology related to chips to China, and then that created then kind of like this, I would say maybe sanction war or economic war. And overall, I think that's also one interesting point, is that we, in this day and age, and it comes back to the initial point that we were making, is that the interdisciplinary part also goes into the multidimensional part. And I would be curious to know as well your view on amphibian war. So the fact that nowadays a war is being basically fought on all kinds of fronts, not just physically on the battlefield, but politically, financially, in the cyberspace, in the technological space, in the economical space, in all kinds of these levels. What is your assessment about, I'm sorry, it's maybe a broad question, but the current situation that we are in right now globally? On that.
That's big. Yeah, that's a good one. But it makes me think a lot about kind of Cold War defense postures of deterrence. I think a lot of this amphibian activity is in under that heading of deterrence, which is the patrolling the seas, trying to look present, trying to just make ourselves known in the Pacific, to not give this sense of license for China to just kind of appropriate territory. One of the PhD students that I was working with was a lieutenant colonel in the Army. And this phrase he used to always use sticks with me. And I use a lot too now because I think it's really persuasive, where he would say that possession is 9/10 of the law. And I think that's actually really pertinent here, which is to say that, like, if you have a vacuum, if you have a void in the South China Sea or, the Middle East, it just kind of allows these actors who might have interests antithetical to ours to take over. And so the U.S. government kind of is acting as though that's the case, which is that the U.S. needs to have this presence to deter these kind of adversaries from taking over and appropriating or creating institutions or systems that are at odds with what, Western democracies value. So I think that's what that activity is. And you see this in, again, kind of using military terminology, like the gray zone space of like using cyber warfare, these operations that people like day to day, you're just not going to see evidence that that's happening. And I actually think that that's broadly consistent with what we've been talking about throughout, which is that the U.S. government wants to stay out of the headlines. And what's the best way to do that? It's to do it through cyber operations. It's to do it through amphibious operations, where people aren't likely to be killed. And I guess I shouldn't say that as criticism, that it's like manipulative to try to stay out of the headlines. I mean, I think in general, the media it gets a lot of criticism, but I don't think it's in these cases just kind of making things up out of thin air. And so when things end up in the headlines, it's generally for good reason. It's because things haven't gone well. For example, when and this didn't happen too long ago, where I think it was 3 service members who were stationed in Jordan, and they were killed by a hostile drone. I forget whether it was an Iranian drone. Anyway, but they were killed. And it was a really good example of what we're talking about, which is, I think most people didn't realize that the U.S. had a military base in Jordan. And so now, as soon as they're killed, well, you now have congressional hearings about, well, what were those military people, what were those service people doing there? Then President Biden has to go to their funeral. And there are so many reasons why that's a bad outcome. And so I think the goal, what we see a lot more of on the part of the government, is to try to kind of engage in activities that will obtain the goals without, kind of like do the least amount of harm possible. So, I don't think that's bad for democracy, but it certainly is trying to kind of find ways to operate, as I like to say, under the radar.
How does Bitcoin's role ensure peace in the world in the context of the taxing war and the unbribed, unlimited spending that is enabled nowadays?
I actually feel like Bitcoin plays a role here more in this question of like, how do we think about innovation and freedom and accountability? And one of the way I see it connecting is taking some of that, sort of democratizing choices about how people live their lives. And one of the things that I think is, this is sort of a more normative question in a way, but when we think about this accountability question with respect to kind of how wars are fought, and these are decisions that are connected very much to central bank policies. And as I'm starting a new study on how countries around the world that are either not fully democratic or that are war torn are using Bitcoin, it's really illuminating, because it suggests that kind of independence from a central government. And in the cases of people I'm talking to, it's central governments that are corrupt or or societies that are war torn. And so where Bitcoin, I think, plays a role is in providing kind of that financial security and independence and freedom for people in countries that are politically risky or militarily risky. And so when I think a subtext of that connects to what we were just talking about regulation is, and actually one of the cases in my book is crypto, and that's where I really see that same pattern of regulators who don't really understand it, and then they just kind of lurch to, we need to do something about this. There are risks here we need to address. And I think there's a risk of under-regulation, but I think there's also a risk of over-regulation. And I think just, again, sort of in my, the upshot of kind of how I think about this and what we were just talking about is that since there is no right answer, but I think often decision makers aren't actually fully apprised. They're not thinking about the trade-offs. They're just thinking, oh, I can rein in crypto, but they don't think about what the costs are in terms of, innovation or in terms of people's financial security or the global south of countries and individuals who are using these, stable coins or using Bitcoin for financial freedom. So I guess that's sort of the connection too between Bitcoin and some of these other things we're talking about, which is let's take a step back and look at the big picture and think about what those trade-offs are, what you're trying to do, and how different policies can actually have these unintended consequences, not just for people in your own country. I think, in the US and the US regulators, and I hear this when I was interviewing people from Europe last week, actually, and in Ukraine, is they say the European regulators are so concerned about Bitcoin and that they don't kind of understand, they have such a narrow focus on this is just speculation and, consumer protection. And there's this whole world out there of other people using Bitcoin and stable coins in ways that regulators in Brussels and Washington aren't always thinking clearly about.
And also, I think the nature of Bitcoin that is obviously compared to to gold in its capacity of limited supply and thereby accountability in spending and responsible spending, sound money, good money, money that actually would de facto prevent war because it is scarce. So you can't. Right. You can't just turn on the money printer. And also maybe the end game of the US in that sense would be, if we take, let's say, a step back on the whole conversation, is the kind of the same scenario that France was during the Napoleonic Wars, where through its immense cost of war, it basically fell into its financial ruin and not being able to sustain itself anymore. And maybe the same fate could play out in one way or another for the US. And in one way or another, Bitcoin could also emerge as maybe that safety boat, as some people in the Bitcoin space call it, or in a way to basically reset a system in a way that is more responsible, in the way finance is spent, and in that sense, wars are being led.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that the scarcity of a resource is so important because you can't spend what you don't have. And being able to tap into that then, because it's scarce, requires a deeper degree of consent than like we were talking about with debt, where you just turn on the printer.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe. Leave your actions down below in the comment section. And if you want to watch more videos, feel free to check the most recent video, but also any other video that we've had published on the channel before. See you next time.